Good morning. We're going to go ahead and get started. I'm Janet Camarina, Director for the Foundation Center San Francisco, and we're very pleased to offer today's Meet the Grantmaker program featuring Bay Area arts funding trends as part of the Foundation Center's annual Funding for Arts Special Focus Month. And first, I just want to acknowledge that none of these programs would be possible without the support of our sponsors, and particularly our Arts Month sponsor, the James Irvine Foundation. So please help me in thanking James Irvine for their support. Out of curiosity, since we do this annually, I expect you're kind of return customers, but how many of you are here at the Foundation Center for the first time? Anybody new? Okay, great. Our plan is working. One of the reasons we do these programs is also to just promote that the center is a resource for you all. It really is a gift from foundations to the nonprofit community. Our mission is to strengthen the social sector by advancing knowledge about philanthropy in the U.S. and around the world. And you can learn more about us at foundationcenter.org. But the main thing to know if you're interested in fundraising is we have a free library upstairs in suite number 606. You can come up and visit us after this program, and there you'll find more than 20 public access computers chock full of expensive databases that you'd ordinarily need a big subscription for. Some of them are our own, some of them are other publishers, and those databases are designed to help you identify potential funding partners. If you've not used us previously, we also teach free classes on the use of these resources, so I hope you take a flyer or again visit us at foundationcenter.org to learn about our free training schedule. As far as Arts Month, it continues beyond this morning's program. You should come back this afternoon for a session on turning your financial performance into a masterpiece with experts from the Northern California Community Loan Fund. That session will be upstairs in our training annex in Suite 606 from 1 to 3 p.m. I encourage you to come up if you're interested in attending at 1 o'clock. And if you like these Meet the Grantmaker programming opportunities, mark your calendar for our final one of 2013, which is coming up on Friday, November 8th, when we bring back our popular corporate philanthropy trends programming in partnership with the Development Executives Roundtable and the San Francisco Business Times, where we feature some of the top corporate philanthropists in the Bay Area as ranked by the SF Business Times annually. This year, the luncheon program will feature representatives from Google, Salesforce, and the Sobrato Foundation, as well as Bank of America. In terms of logistics for this morning's program, you should have picked up a handout with the speaker biographies, and I invite you to look at it now to get to know our panelists a bit better, since I won't be reading the bios in the interest of time to get to the questions that I'm sure you all have. And as far as questions, we will take questions after our panel discussion, so please hold your questions until we open it up for the Q&A period. We are video recording this session, and we will make it available on our YouTube channel after the session for the benefit of those who can't be here today, as well as weeks from now when you're trying to remember what they said, you can check the YouTube channel. So when we do open up the moderated Q&A, what that means is I will ask you to queue up here at the podium because we want your question to be picked up by the recording. Otherwise, people will see you talking but not hear what you're saying. Usually questions are slow to start because people are shy, and that's a good time to get a jump because later on the line can get long and we might not be able to get to everyone. So I encourage you to come up early when I'm mentioning that we're about to open up the Q&A. Also, for those of you with smartphones or other devices, feel free to tweet about this event. Our hashtag is FCArts, and it's posted on the column of the room as a reminder. And again, to refer your colleagues to this recording later, check our YouTube channel as well as our media archive where we post highlights of the event at grantspace.org. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce this morning's panel. Joining us today, we'll hear from Katie Fahey, Program Associate for the Arts at the Kenneth Rainin Foundation. Next to Katie is Frances Phillips, Program Director for the Arts and the Creative Work Fund from the Walter and Elise Haas Fund. Next to Frances is John McGurk, Program Director for the Performing Arts at the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. Next to John is Ted Romo, Program Officer for the Arts at the San Francisco Foundation. And Ted Russell, Senior Program Officer for the James Irvine Foundation. Please help me in welcoming this morning's panel. do need to share this because this mic doesn't do the job that well. So I want to mention that I have a list of questions, but we're going to have some lead responders to some of them, again, to try and leave as much time for audience Q&A. But this first question is actually appropriate for everyone. And it's just kind of a landscape setting question where I'm asking you to share your current grant-making priorities and eligibility guidelines as they pertain to Bay Area arts organizations, including the specific regions which you support. And it's an opportunity to share the procedures for applying to your foundation for support, including any upcoming deadlines that the audience should be made aware of. So Katie, we'll start with you.
I'll preface what I'm going to say by saying that everything that I'm about to say is available online. So those of you thinking of furiously writing, you don't need to do that. It's all up online, and you can always ask us questions. I always think it's better to not to assume eligibility, but to ask questions if you have them. We're happy to talk to you. But generally speaking, the Kenneth Rainin Fund the Kenneth Rainin Foundation funds small and mid-sized performing arts organizations. And by small and mid-sized, we mean ranging between $10,000 and $2 million budgets. And by 10,000, we mean for the last fiscal year. So that's a good point of clarification. We also fund film through the San Francisco Film Society, and I'll get to that later on. Within the performing arts, we fund dance, theater, and multidisciplinary arts organizations. And I'm going to get the bad out of the way. I'll tell you what we don't fund within those categories. We don't fund performances without strong roots in dance or theater. So again, we fund multidisciplinary, but they must have strong foundations in dance or theater. We don't fund music-focused productions or predominantly music-focused productions. Again, that's a little bit flexible, but again, talk to us if you have questions about that. Within that, we don't usually fund music, theater, and opera. And we also don't fund youth-focused programs. So now that that's over with, I'll tell you what we do fund and are really excited about and prioritize. We prioritize funding for innovative, contemporary, and experimental projects, productions in outdoor, site-specific, and alternative venues, multidisciplinary and or dynamic collaborations, again, with foundations in dance or theater, projects that support the effectiveness of arts organizations. And that's a fancy way of saying projects that support multiple artists. It's playwright incubator programs, residencies, and space sharing initiatives are some examples of those. Another thing to keep in mind, and I'm sure is the case with all these other foundations up here, is you can always check out our recipient pages. Ours are actually not so intimidating or boring to look at. They're nice photos, and they also have the amounts there that previous groups have gotten from us, so that's a good reference as well. So that roughly outlines the eligibility requirements for two of our programs, the two core programs of the foundation, our Visibility Awards and our Impact Grants program. The Visibility Awards are project support, and the Impact Grants are capacity building support, and they're multi-year. They're 3-year grants, and then followed by 2 years of general operating if goals are met. And one thing to note about that is that the impact grants are only open to previous grantees of the foundation, so you must have had a Visibility Award grant before applying to the Impact Grants program. Like many of these foundations up here, I think we require 501c3 status of our grantees or to have them fiscally sponsored. So we do fund, sometimes we will fund individual artists, but they'll need to be fiscally sponsored. And they'll usually need to be in collaboration with an organization. Geographically, we fund 6 counties, theoretically. We fund Alameda, Contra Costa, Marin, San Francisco, San Mateo, and Santa Clara. So we've just become a little bit more explicit about our priority actually is San Francisco. We're currently focused on Central Market specifically. And that doesn't mean that we won't accept proposals from other counties. As you can see in our recipient list, we fund a lot in the East Bay, Berkeley, and Oakland. So we will accept applications from all 6 counties, but San Francisco and specifically Central Market is our priority right now. And we are evolving our thinking around this, so please, by all means, check back on our website for updates. I even updated it last week, so that is a good practice to have in mind. Finally, one thing that's a little bit different about our foundation is that we don't often fund consecutively. And so that's something to keep in mind, for future planning. Some exceptions that we have to that rule are programs that serve multiple artists, such as festivals, residencies, and commissioning programs. So, with the Visibility Award specifically, we're trying to reach a broad range of groups through our funding. So it's no offense to the many qualified organizations and who are doing excellent work out there. But yeah, and on that note, I'll also say, apply again if you've been declined. Sometimes we just can't fund multiple years in a row.
Thanks, Katie. And just a follow-up, since you mentioned all of that's on your website, but some priorities are more competitive than others. So can you give maybe a tip to people in the room if there's a certain priority that you wish you had more requests coming in, or you said theoretically when you said the region, so does that mean that some regions just aren't applying as much as others, and as a result it's less competitive?
Yeah, that's a good question. And also I'll say again that we are evolving our thinking around this. We actually expect to get some greater clarity on it in the coming month. We don't often get proposals from the South Bay or the North Bay. Very few, actually. But we are funding. There are some excellent proposals that we get from the East Bay, and so we have funding for them as well. But yes, again, we're going to be evolving our thinking around it. In terms of priorities that we wish we got more applications, I think that there has been a little bit of a misconception in that because our foundation is located in Oakland, that we prioritize funding for Oakland. And in fact, it's the case that we're so interested in seeing activation, neighborhood-oriented projects happening in Central Market. And so if you have multiple projects and you had to pick the one that you're doing in Central Market if you can.
Great, thanks, Katie.
Oh, and actually, I forgot a whole other section of what I'm going to say, which is our funding for the through the San Francisco Film Society. We have a partnership with the San Francisco Film Society, and I'll try to get this acronym out. It's the SFFS KRF Filmmaking Grant. And it's important to know that the arts program staff of the foundation do not review those applications. However, our president, Jen Rainin, she sits on the review panel with the San Francisco Film Society. All the grants are accepted, or all the grant applications are accepted and ultimately allocated through the San Francisco Film Society. So if you have specific questions about those grants, best to refer to them. And just to give you an idea of what they fund through that program, they're narrative feature films that explore the social issues of our time. They are not for documentary film. And the purpose is to support meaningful projects nationally that benefit and uplift the Bay Area filmmaking community. So you can refer to them for deadlines. I know you asked about deadlines. Our LOI, our next LOI cycle, we don't actually have a deadline set just yet. We're waiting on setting a board meeting date to define that, but it will open in January, and the deadline will be towards the end of January.
Great, thanks, Katie. And Frances, your turn.
Thank you. So I'm from the Walter and Elise Haas Fund, and my story, if you've been here in previous years and some of your faces are familiar, you can just snooze for a little while and then wake up, because things have not changed very much. Right.
No one ever sleeps when you talk.
Well, so the arts program at the Walter and Elise Haas Fund, actually all the programs at the Walter and Elise Haas Fund have this overarching interest in building cultural and civic participation. So everything we're doing in the arts is supposed to link back to that greater theme. And we do 4 things, and 3 of them have a lot in common with one another, and 1 is quite different. So, arts education, about half of our arts budget is invested in in-school and out-of-school sustained arts learning opportunities with a special interest in kids who are low income with limited access to the arts. We have a new and not explicitly announced, but we've been looking for and funding a few projects that are serving kids in the juvenile justice system, and that's been new for us. We have an interest in passing down cultural traditions in recent immigrant communities. We follow that interest area with kind of a large annual grant to the Alliance for California Traditional Arts and other grants for capacity building to arts organizations that are really based within recent immigrant communities. And then we have a grant-making arena to which everybody who doesn't fit the first two categories applies to because it sounds so general to them, which is called Cultural Commons. And we do two kinds of things in that area. One is supporting high-quality, free programs that have a track record for reaching a diverse cross-section of the population, or a promise for serving a diverse cross-section of the population, local population. The other thing are projects or programs that specifically focus on bringing people together across differences in gender preference, age, not gender preference, sexual identity, culture. An example I often give, which is not the only appropriate example, is we've funded the Generations Film Project, which is a project of Frameline that offers a filmmaking class for LGBT teens and LGBT elders in which they identify shared concerns and make cross-generational short films together that are then shown at the International LGBT Film Festival. So that is one kind of example of that program. On the kind of free access, we've funded, let's see, Stephen's here from Stern Grove Festival. We funded Yerba Buena Arts and Events. We funded Chrissy Broadcasts last weekend and trolley dances the weekend before. So a number of programs are kind of out in neighborhoods and often free or in community settings. Those programs have a lot in common. They're focused primarily in San Francisco and Alameda County, and to us, Alameda County is not as big as it really is. It's primarily Berkeley and Oakland. And the family did not fund in Alameda County until a branch of the family owned the Oakland A's for a number of years and became very involved in Oakland during that time.
Now, is that because that's where the requests come from? Would you consider Southern Alameda County, or is that is that part of the priority?
A request from Southern Alameda County would not be as successful, so we don't fund a lot in Hayward, Livermore, et cetera, for the Walter and Elise Haas Fund. And there's plenty to do in the areas where we are funding with the size budget that we have. The other thing is we're kind of a mid-sized foundation. Our overall grant making is $11.5 million, and the trustees think of us as being a mid-sized foundation. So, also our trustees like to see organizations that have funding partners. So let's say you're an organization and you have one or two $40,000 grants and a bunch of $10,000 grants. We're a good foundation to ask for about $25,000 because we're kind of in the mid-range of grants that you're getting from others. We receive and review proposals on an ongoing basis. We don't have deadlines for the Walter and Elise Haas Fund. The turnaround time is about 4 months. People are always asking us when the next board meeting is, and it is the case that your grant might not be reviewed at a board meeting. It might be reviewed in between board meetings. Our board primarily meets over anything in capital, anything multi-year, anything large, anything that raises questions about policy. So assuming that you will get an ultimate answer if you're being invited to be given serious consideration in 4 months is a pretty safe assumption. One of the questions, let's see, I like to talk to people on the phone. That's my personal preference. I do email exchanges for people who have work lives where that just doesn't work very well. My own working style is I find back and forth in a telephone conversation is often more efficient than the 15 emails. And, Better for me. I don't, I'm at my desk a lot of the time because we have relatively narrow geographic scope, unlike Ted and John, who have bigger geographic areas that they're serving. Let's see.
As far as guidelines, do you want to talk about the Creative Work Fund a little bit?
I do, but I'm going to just say two more things quickly. Our general practice is that if we're really, we fund some things that are projects, we fund some, particularly in arts education, things in a more general operating support kind of way. We are willing to fund things for up to 3 consecutive years, and then people are expected to take a break for 2 years. So we do cycle in and out of support for our grantees. We feel as if 3 years gives you time to do something meaningful, to develop something, to learn something, and also some time to develop resources from others. So that means that I have an ongoing process in which, back in the day when the budget was sort of was a bit bigger than it is right now, about 60 to 65% of my grants in any given year were renewals of grants from prior years. And 15 to 20 were brand new to the foundation, and 15 to 20% were organizations that previously had been funded and were coming back for funding again. As the budget shrank a couple of years, only slightly, but it began to hurt after it happened a few times, the door for new organizations coming in to apply went down to about 10%. And I do not know what my 2014 budget is, and I won't know until late November. So right now, I'm kind of holding on to things that are requests from brand new grantees. So quickly about the Creative Work Fund. I am doing a webinar on Monday between 6 and 7 that is only about the Creative Work Fund. And I've just done a bunch of workshops and webinars on it. And there is a podcast of a webinar, if Monday is inconvenient for you, that's on the Creative Work Fund website. Creative Work Fund is a collaborative program, and a lot of things that I said about the Walter and Elise Haas Fund are not true of the Creative Work Fund. It funds in 11 counties in this area, north to Napa-Sonoma, south to Santa Cruz, Monterey. Poor me, I had to make a presentation in Carmel yesterday. I have Yountville. I've got a few other very lovely, but I've also been to Salinas, and I've also been to, and the Creative Work Fund has been, in recent years, it was always a collaboration among multiple funders, and in recent years it's been, our primary additional funding has come from 2 of my colleagues to my right, the James Irvine Foundation and the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. Ted will be talking about the new Irvine Foundation guidelines, and they will not be funding the Creative Work Fund beginning next year. So the Creative Work Fund budget, which has been about $650,000 a year for project grants where an artist makes a new work by collaborating with a nonprofit organization, our budget will shrink to about $480,000 to $500,000 for grants. Still a nice, robust amount of money, and Irvine's been so fabulous that we just love them. And of course, we still love Hewlett, which is still funding us.
What are the disciplines for 2014?
Thank you, John. The disciplines for 2014. There is a hard and fast deadline for letters of inquiry this year on December 6th at 5 p.m. And the disciplines are, it's for projects in which the lead artist is either a literary artist or a performing artist. And for us, literary arts are poetry, fiction, creative nonfiction, and spoken word poetry. And for us, the performing arts could either be a performer, say a violinist, a percussionist, or a originator of a work, a choreographer, a composer, a playwright. We put playwrights in performing arts. And Creative Work Fund is a very competitive program. We've funded some things. We don't have rules about large or small organizations. I'm proud of what it's done. There's a press release about the grantees from last year to give you some sense of what we're talking about when we say collaboration. And I'll let John take over.
Thanks, Frances. John, tell us about Hewlett.
Thanks, Janet, for having us here again. Hewlett Foundation focuses its $16 million of grant making in the San Francisco Bay Area and the 11 counties that touch San Francisco. We look at organizations that have at least a budget of $100,000 and intend to provide multi-year general support to about the top 10-15% of organizations in this region. So we recognize that there's about 2,500 performing arts organizations in the Bay Area, and we try to fund about 250 of them. We also have a second priority for multidisciplinary arts education in the state of California. This is for organizations whose mission is solely focused on policy or arts education delivery. And it includes visual arts. So we take a larger geography, we add another discipline, and we look at the entire state when it comes to arts education. These are both described in detail on our website, so I encourage you to look there if you're interested in learning more. Our selection criteria for all grantees, new and returning, are the same. So everyone is held to the same standard of artistic quality, audiences and participants, leadership, which includes your board, your staff, and artistic leadership, all guided by a viable strategic plan. Financial responsibility, how have you performed historically? And the last category we call alignment, which is how do you fit into our portfolio? What is your unique role within the arts ecosystem? We have an open letter of inquiry process on our website. It's an electronic process. We do not take phone calls, unlike Francis, as we encourage folks, given the number of organizations, to go through our website to submit a very simple letter of inquiry. Our preferences for letters of inquiry are also listed there, such as underrepresented regions within our portfolio, Solano County, East Contra Costa County, Inland Monterey, Inland Santa Cruz. About 50% of our grants are currently located in the city of San Francisco, and so if you're located here, it's a very, very high bar. It's very competitive to get into the portfolio. Francis mentioned the Creative Work Fund. Hewlett works with 18 regranting partners. So we give money to a pooled fund like the Creative Work Fund, and then other artists and peers distribute that money to the community. So our regranting partners are listed on our website as well. Many local arts councils, community foundations, discipline-specific service organizations like Theater Bay Area or dancers groups. So if you don't get Hewlett money directly, there are, we hope, many, many opportunities for you to receive Hewlett money indirectly through these regranting partners and pooled funds. That's my start.
All right. And how about budget? Well, we're...
budget, we anticipate will increase slightly next year, stock market willing, but about $16 million.
Great. Dada, welcome back.
Thank you. Thank you for having me back. I'm going to talk a little bit about the San Francisco Foundation, and we're different from the other colleagues here in that we are a community foundation. So in a sense, we are, one definition would be a bank for donors. So that's the reality is. The reality is that in 1947, Mr. Koshland got together some other business colleagues, and they said, let's do something, bring together all of our funds, and then pool our resources so we can do things, and that way we can create greater impact. So all these years later, the foundation has grown. We are one of the largest foundations nationally. The arts are one of 5 core areas. We also do community development, community health, environment, and education, along with the arts and culture. Now, that being said, our budget is much smaller in terms of the arts, but what we've decided to do is to use the arts in a way to leverage the impact and the support and the resources in the 5 county area that we serve. So we do grant in Marin, Alameda, Contra Costa, San Mateo, and then San Francisco. In terms of our funding, most of it is, as the other colleagues have said, Alameda and San Francisco counties get the bulk of the grants, not only in arts and culture, but across the foundation. We underwent a strategic plan in 2010, and we have a 5-year strategic plan. The arts and culture actually went into alignment with that strategic plan a year ago. And some of you who were here last year heard about the alignment and what that meant in terms of our funding focuses. We have two general areas within arts and culture that we're focusing on now with our new guidelines. And the first one is support to small and mid-sized organizations. And we define a small to mid-sized organization is a budget between $100,000 and $2 million. And then the other focus that we have is for how can we integrate the arts within the full service community schools movement. And that has to do with really realizing how large the arts education piece is, and that with our funds wanting to be able to have some kind of impact, and also realizing that, especially since we work a lot and very closely with our education program program officer, to see how could we leverage the support that they give to full service community schools so that the arts become part of that definition. And then when now going forward, at least in the Bay Area, if someone says full service community schools, the arts are automatically in there, along with a community clinic and parent engagement, which are things that are now currently defined under the full service community schools model. So those are the two areas. It is very competitive. We got almost 300 applications last year, and roughly about 130 of them were from arts education organizations, and then about 180 were for arts and culture organizations for general operating support. So I'll leave it at that and get a little bit more into specifics when we continue the discussion.
And while we're on the San Francisco Foundation, can you tell us about your budget outlook for 2014?
I was going to talk about this later, but I'll launch into it tonight. Right now, the budget stayed flat, and that has a lot to do with, because we are a community foundation that also uses our funds for leveraging additional income, which comes also much like colleagues through interest income and investments. We are now, our budget has gotten back up to the level that it was before the economic recession. So right now I'm looking at about $1.5 million of just re-granting funds. And then there's a separate $500,000 that come in from donor advised funds. And those are specifically for arts awards. So a donor, all of them but one who have passed away, in their wills left funds for, we have 2 grants for MFA graduate students. We have one for a playwright award, and then another one for photography. And these awards, like I said, are set up. They're very specific to what the donor intent is. So there's about $500,000 for those funds that we award annually.
Great, thanks, Ted. And Ted.
Janet, thanks a lot, and just glad to be here at Foundation Center again. Irvine's very proud to be sponsoring Arts Month, and
And
this is
we're
always a
proud to
great
have
session.
Irvine sponsors. Thank you.
So we still get the love, Francis? And one of the things that's happened with Irvine that Francis alluded to is that we have refocused our arts grant-making strategy. About 3 years ago, we went through a major planning process and decided to really target a very specific efforts. I'll talk about that, but first maybe I'll talk about our basic guideline, who's eligible, so folks can decide who can take a nap and who can't. So our eligibility for all of our initiatives is with funding of an operating budget above $100,000. We also have a restriction on government funding that came from Mr. James Irvine from his will and trust and his wish to not supplant government funding. So there is a restriction for groups to have less than 50% government funding, and that's from all entities, so whatever combination of city, county, state, national. So that's the restriction, and we do fund across California, and it is very competitive because we actually try to fund somewhat proportionally. So if you think about the large number of arts organizations in the Bay Area, the quality and sophistication of the work that you do, the programs that you have, it's actually more competitive for applicants from the Bay Area for that reason, because we do try to fund somewhat proportionally. And if you look at the rest of the state, there just aren't as many high-level arts groups per capita. So that's one of the challenges. So now focusing on our strategy, we have arts engagement, and I want to give you our particular definition because Francis is talking about civic and cultural engagement. There's lots of definitions of community engagement, so the word engagement is being bandied about, and probably for good reasons, because we really are trying to connect with the people in our community. So At Irvine, what we focused on is a new strategy that has three primary elements. It's about who engages. We're very focused on organizations that are connecting with low-income communities and/or ethnically specific communities that have been underrepresented. I always try to make sure that people understand the and/or factor, because not all low-income people are the ethnically diverse communities. Not all people in the ethnically diverse communities are low-income, just to be clear. So in terms of looking at who's engaging with the programming, it's about that definition of the who. We also look at how people are engaging, because we've long supported people observing the arts, people going to galleries, people going to theaters, observing performances. And you can argue how passive or active someone is within that type of experience, but we're now looking very specifically at funding organizations working with community members to be the art makers, to be active participants and engage in the process in that way. And we aren't entirely moving away from funding things that are observational. There are a lot of things that we're currently funding out of this strategy that have that element, but we are looking to shift and kind of balance. If you think about two legs of one side being more observational, the other side being more active participation by the audience member, by the community participant, we're just trying to balance the funding out to look at those other strategies. And that's primary to engage with lots of community members. We look at a lot of the diverse communities, and the research we've seen showed that a lot of people are participating in the arts, participating in culture, but they aren't necessarily engaged with our cultural institutions, right? So if you look at all the funding statistics, the most you'll ever see is 50% of any given community, county, state are participating with our nonprofit arts, but we know a lot of those people are engaged with the arts, so that's just part of the reason for our strategy of looking at how people participate. And the third leg of our arts engagement strategy looks at where people participate, and this is about venues, looking at non-traditional venues, spaces, parks, community centers, faith-based institutions, because we actually want to have more opportunities to present the arts where people are. So if we're trying to reach these different communities, in some cases, some people, even if you have the exact programming that's tailored to them and it's free, you may even provide transportation, there's still people who are resistant to going downtown to the arts center. But if you bring that same art out to them, it's very easy for them to find, participate, maybe work through some existing community organizations that serve them. So this is another element. So the entire set of pieces of who participates, how they participate, where they participate, is all designed around getting more Californians engaged with the nonprofit arts. So that's the whole point and thrust of our strategy. To now focus on the funding opportunities, we've primarily done this since June 2012 through the Exploring Engagement Fund. So we've made almost 5 rounds of grants now. We have our last round coming up. And we basically have 3 funds, and the main thing I can say is that these were designed as experiments for us to look at all these types of engagement. We wanted to give groups risk capital, because for most groups that we were engaging, these were new strategies for them. There are some groups that have long been working out in the community in non-traditional venues. There's some groups that have always had programs that engage people in art making, but for most groups, this was trying something new. Even for the groups that already had existing programmings, we were telling them, hey, here's some additional funding in terms of an opportunity to allow you to experiment with those programs, perhaps expand what you're doing. So after these 5 rounds of experimentation, we're very much going to be refining the Exploring Engagement Fund. So we're at a unique moment, and it's probably not what people want to hear, but at the moment we don't have an active Exploring Engagement Fund that has an open opportunity, so there's no date to write down to apply for. Okay, at least no one's shooting daggers, but there's lots of funding opportunities to my left. But just so you know, at Irvine, we really look at ourselves as a learning institution. We design these as a piloting strategy for us to also learn how to better fund these types of projects, and that's why we're looking at the data. We have an evaluation. Those first round of grants that went out in 2012 are just going to be completed as 2-year grants next June, so we're looking at everything very closely to refine how we continue to do the experiment. So the dates to write down are at some point next year, most likely in the spring sometime. We'll announce the refined Exploring Engagement Funds. They may be very similar. They may be pretty different than the previous ones. So we've actually taken the information from the previous Exploring Engagement Funds off our website so as to not mislead people who are coming to this anew. The main things we're looking at are, once again, will still be experimentation. It'll still be around this definition of arts engagement. We have certain components in terms of how people apply for these funds. It's an entirely online application process. There's not a letter of inquiry. It's not about making the phone calls. It really is that when a round of this is announced, and it's one for which a group is eligible, because sometimes we'll do it regionally. There might be something that's just for our priority regions inland. There might be something that's for the rest of the state. Sometimes there's a budget size split, but really that's the only limitation for arts groups that actually have programming that would fit. So in general, you'll want to track which fund you'd be eligible fund out of the family of exploring engagement funds. Those definitions will be changed. The best thing you can do is you can actually sign up. We've created a place, if you look at our arts program page on irvine.org, irvine.org. If you look in the arts page, you can actually sign up to be updated by things that are happening in the arts program, and that'll especially include the announcement of the new funds next spring. What I can say about the timing is it's likely that the next deadline would be in 2014 at the earliest, with funding to occur in 2015. So that's the earliest that might happen given the work we're doing. That would have an online application process. Usually it's a two-stage process where we have a relatively brief application that allows us to sort through what may be anywhere from 100 to 150 applications coming in from around the state. And then we have a more lengthy proposal for groups that are selected to fully develop those. Always our proposals require use of the California Cultural Data Project, which some of you may be familiar with. How many people are familiar with it already? Okay, I'll explain it some then. Basically, this allows a lot of funders to have a common application component that allows you to include 10 categories of information about your programming, about your staffing, about your finances, and put it in one place through the Cultural Data Project. And once that information is completed, funders that use it actually have an automatically generated form that works for their program. So for Irvine, we have specially designated reports that are generated for our individual funds. So you can look up California Cultural Data Project and find out more about that. But that is something that's required for all groups at the proposal stage. Just to outline that.
And then people can follow you on Twitter if you have announcements too, right?
Yes, follow Arts Ted on Twitter, so that's my handle. So it's at ARTSTED, and that's a good way of tracking what's happening. And I generally try to track things that are happening at Irvine, especially things related to arts engagement. And then last but not least, I'll know you'll ask me about our funding.
Your
So
budget,
for this year for across the state in the arts, because overall Irvine has 3 programs, it's been about $80 million of funding for this year. This year it'll be 14 million. I wish it was 40. This year it'll be 14, and we won't know for sure until the board sets the numbers, but we're looking at approximately $14 million again for next year, and that's for all the arts funds across the state.
Thanks, Ted. And Katie, I don't think I had a chance to follow up with you about your budget. So is it up, down, flat? What are you projecting for 2014?
So our budget is actually up significantly from previous years, but 2014's budget will be exactly the same as 2013, which is $2.5 million. That said, in the next 3 years, we expect it to grow up to $5 million plus. So that's something we're really excited about. Our capacity will really increase at that point, 2015. So, jump on that.
Mark the calendars. All right, well, one of the purposes of this panel is to inform our audience about trends in the Bay Area art scene. So what can you tell us about new directions for your portfolios, upcoming announcements, or external influences that you see affecting arts grant making? And this is where we have some lead responders, and I'm going to go back to Ted and then come to Katie for this one.
Okay, what a great way of pausing so I can tell you about our other upcoming program for which you're not necessarily eligible. Now we're developing, right? How fun is this? Yeah, on video even. So the next project we're working on is the second stage of our work, and this is part of why we're refining the Exploring Engagement Funds. It's called our New California Arts Fund. It's a new program for current grantees that are most aligned with this engagement strategy. So right now we're working with proposals, and we'll fund from 7 to 10 grantees in December that are deeply involved with arts engagement, as I've described it, working with these communities, working in alternative venues, in some cases working with arts making projects. And this is actually a program that's both capacity building based and about programming. So for groups that are deeply aligned, we actually want them to build their infrastructure, their staffing, their cultural competency, everything that it takes for these groups to have more sustainable engagement programs, while also offering additional funding to supplement what they're probably already doing with something from an Explore Engagement Fund, our previous grant for groups that were so aligned before we even came up with the new funds. They were already working these areas. So this new California Arts Fund will be something to look for in mid-December when we announce it, because that'll give you a sense of groups that are really taking this on passionately and thinking about involving engagement for the long term. You can see why the new California Arts Fund would be distinguished from the Exploring Engagement Fund, which is all about piloting, experimenting, seeing what happens. The new California Arts Fund is all about deeper aspects of engagement, doing it for the long term. And in order to supplement this and help the field learn from it, bless you, we'll actually have a learning community from those participating organizations that over the course of the 3-year grants, they'll get together, they'll be provided additional resources. The organizations and the executive directors will all be able to meet together over time and learn from each other. And we actually plan to collect some of the learning, videotape things, probably put together some papers and documents that we'll publish about best practices, in some cases just about the change management of changing an organization to better integrate these strategies, a lot of which will be useful for groups that aren't looking at engagement as we define it per se, but simply want to be very relevant to their communities. So this entire program is about adaptation and being a 21st century organization. So even if a group isn't particularly interested in the ways we've laid this out, it's about how these groups will be adapting over the course of the next 3 years and coming up with plans that are really designed to take them to 2023. So looking at the long term, how to position an organization to be ready for the future California.
So to kind of synthesize, I guess, some of the trends that embodies are, besides the audience engagement priority, working deeper with the grantees so that you're building their capacity and building the infrastructure, and also creating a learning community of peers. So I'm wondering, as I turn to Katie now, if that resonates as trends you're seeing for the other grant makers. But Katie, how about you?
I was just going to share what I think is not so much a trend, but more of a natural evolution of art history and I guess our time now and societal pressures, which is that art needs to go beyond being beautiful and being intellectually stimulating. It needs to do something else. It needs to have a social impact. It needs to create change. It needs to revitalize urban environments. It needs to be an economic stimulus. I think I would say personally, I think that's a lot to ask of a lot of art, what art can do. But there are strategies that are trying to incorporate some of those things. I think Ted touched on a lot of engagement work through the Irvine Foundation. Something that I think in order to achieve or even get close to achieving some of these sort of lofty changes or impacts, we need to have collaboration. And so collaboration is a major value of the Kenneth Rainin Foundation, and it's something that we're doing in Central Market specifically. We're collaborating with the Mayor's Office of Economic and Workforce Development, the San Francisco Arts Commission, and Grants for the Arts, where we meet with them pretty regularly and talk about what we can do to revitalize Central Market. And again, we're not expecting the arts to do that on their own. We're hoping to help facilitate that and in collaboration with artists and arts organizations as well. The ultimate goal is to stabilize and revitalize Central Market as an arts district, as San Francisco's downtown arts district. And so that's a little bit more about our work in Central Market. Another thing I just wanted to touch on is our Impact Grants program, to go back to that for a moment, because it is a relatively new initiative. We actually had our first round of grantees in early 2013. As I said before, the Impact Grants are for capacity building support. Previously, we had only the Visibility Awards, and we're a relatively new foundation, so we're growing, and we wanted to do something that was multi-year and provide a different kind of support for organizations. So I'll tell you just a little bit more about the Impact Grants program, and you can also read online. Our first round of grantees ranged in size from small organizations to mid-size. Some of the smaller ones, or some of the examples of organizations that we've had this past year are Robert Moses's Kin, Counterpulse, Crowded Fire, and the Magic Theater. So also ranging in how long they've been around as well. Again, it's capacity building support and program effectiveness. That's usually for the emerging organizations. And then we help established groups navigate organizational transitions as well through that program. We actually work with a consultant, Marcy Hinnon from Helicon Collaborative, who works directly with the impact grantees and helps them establish a capacity building program, or plan. It's a fabulous program, and she's a fabulous person to work with. And she helps establish goals with those organizations, and the grants tend to range in size from $25,000 to $50,000 a year. Again, over 3 years. And what we're trying to do through that grant program is also create a cohort of organizations. And so we have semi-regular convenings with them. We host workshops. We recently did one with Marcy from Helicon, as well as the Nonprofit Finance Fund. So we're serious about sort of building those capacity, those tools for organizations as well. Financial management and things like that, building financial literacy. So those are kind of the two new things I wanted to share.
I wanted to share something too.
Sure, and actually, I just want to jump into the next trend question, and then you're going to be asked to respond to that, so you can bundle.
I was gonna punt that to these guys.
Oh, okay. Well, while we're on the subject of trends, one of the realities of doing this work against the backdrop of Silicon Valley is the maker and creator culture it seems to have spawned. So I'd like you to reflect on how the disparate but interconnected forces like Burning Man, social networks, hacker-maker culture are influencing the arts. Some say it's always been the case that the arts reflect technology at the time, such as photography or film, but some say today's technology is a fundamental shift because of the way it can democratize the arts and engage diverse audiences in its creation. So please share whether and how these influences are shaping or informing your work. And for this one, the lead responders are John, Ted, and Tere. And Tere, since I interrupted you, if you want to go ahead and jump in.
You're going to let them respond? I feel that that's more in line with what they do.
Okay, and did you have a different trend you wanted to comment on a minute ago?
Well, just briefly, and I think it fits in terms of a trend, or at least how a lot of funders are looking at how can we have greater impact. And I think part of that has been because of the recession hitting all of us, because the funding we give a lot of times comes from the market income and the interest and investment income, that I think we all realized we're not always going to have as much funds as are needed out in the community, and especially the Bay Area. As Ted said, the sheer amount of organizations, large and small, the demographics, the energy that's here. So I think all of us have been looking at how do we have greater impact with the funds we have, because we're going to probably stay level, or who knows when we may go through this again. And so it's been a very much of a sobering effect, I think, but also an opportunity. And for us at the foundation, we took that on as saying, okay, the arts budget is what it is. We're going to try to see what we can do. And when I first came in, looking at where we were going and looking at how, if we still kept trying to do that wide casting the net approach, we were looking at $5,000 grants to 100 organizations. And was that really impactful? A $5,000 grant to the San Francisco Opera, can I really say I'm having, or that the foundation is having impact? And so that's when we started to look at how could we look at how our funding would be able to at least be able to say we were able to come and fund an organization, and at least with a $20,000 grant to a smaller mid-sized organization, there is something that we can look at, and they can say this is what it was able to do for them. Also, I think the other one was how can we, in a sense, help those organizations who are going through a lot of economic strife. A lot of them, small and mid-sized, who were doing all the great work of engagement, of working in their communities, but were not able to have, the donor who could write the big check, or have a board that could come up with the gaps that were, coming up very quickly for a lot of these organizations. So what we're trying to do now, because one of our pillars along with impact through the strategic plan was social justice. So what does that look like? And for us, it's really trying to figure out how we can have access, greater access out in the community, and also equity. And as I say on the guidelines, for us, arts are a human right. So how do we make that happen for those communities that don't have access or don't have the ability to make arts, or at least recognize that they have arts in their communities, and how can we support that? So within that, we also have a cohort that we pulled together. And a lot of this was meeting with a lot of these donors here at the table and saying, what are you doing? How are you approaching this? And thinking about how could we pull together an arbitrary number of 15 organizations across the 5 Bay Area counties that are very much artistic hubs and cultural anchors for their communities or for their art forms. So it's a range of organizations, from large ones like Alonzo King's Line Ballet, East Bay Center for the Performing Arts, to smaller groups such as the Queer Women of Color Media Arts Project, organizations that are doing some really interesting and important work in the community or in their art form, but just need that stabilization. And so it is also a long-term commitment, working with a lot of other funders who are also interested in funding these organizations. How can we come together to help these organizations, not only just logistically, so they're not going to 15 cohort meetings, but at the same time, how can we leverage each other's support to go in this same direction of greater support and stabilization for some of these organizations.
Great. Thanks, Terry. And going back to John and Ted for the Burning Man social networks, hacker maker culture part of the question as far as trends. And John, why don't we let you in on the conversation, since it's been a while since.
I think what we're talking about is two macro trends, actually. The first macro trend in my mind is decreasing attendance at observational art forms. So for the past 2 decades, we've seen audiences decreasing at the symphony, the opera, the ballet, Western classical art forms, where you basically go and observe. We call that observational art form. At the exact same time, we've seen rapidly increasing personal engagement. Technology is a piece of this. Every man is an artist. With my iPhone, I'm now a filmmaker, I'm a curator of music. And also, the technology is dramatically impacting how art is created or disseminated or consumed. I give the example to the Hewlett board a few months ago that when Mr. and Mrs. Hewlett 50 years ago wanted to see the opera, they got their $200 a seat tickets and went down on Friday night at 8 o'clock and saw the performance, and at 10 o'clock they went on their way home. Now, if you want to see the opera, you can go to the ballpark and see it simulcast for free, or you can go to the Castro Theater in your jeans and eat popcorn, or you can watch it on your iPhone. And opera hasn't changed, but the way you can see opera, the way you can engage with opera has significantly increased. So we take 2 approaches. First, we try to minimize the folks that are leaving or not coming to the observational art forms. We have to find a way to make those art forms relative to this next generation of audiences. And secondly, we look for ways where we can increase personal engagement, recognizing that a lot of folks now want to do it, not just see it. So, for example, piano sales have skyrocketed in the last 2 decades. But at the same time, participation of buying tickets to go see a piano concert has decreased. So how do we start to think about people doing it and seeing it? Social networks that you mentioned, intentional communities like Burning Man, these are all, in my mind, ways and responses in which our communities, very broadly and generally, are reacting and responding to these new ways of creating and disseminating art and engaging with people to learn across sort of these cultural boundaries that have been pretty historically set. So that's sort of my lens of how we're looking at these long-term trends and trying to understand the impact here for organizations in the short term, but also recognizing the rapidly changing demographics of our communities, and as we're moving forward, who has access to technology. There's a digital divide. It still is very much along the lines of income and race ethnicity. and who has access to the arts more generally within their communities.
So to a degree, it's about keeping arts relevant to the majority of the population at this point.
As much as possible.
Ted.
John, that's a great outline of the trends, and I deeply, deeply, deeply want to just amen what he said, because these are really important aspects and part of why we're working the way we do. So given that, I will actually talk about what I think is a great example of an institution diving into this. And it may surprise you that this cutting-edge institution I'm going to talk to you about is the Fresno Art Museum, especially because a few years ago when John was in our shop over at Irvine, we observed the Fresno Art Museum having a near-death experience, and the Fresno Metropolitan Museum had already gone out of business in their community, and the Fresno Art Museum was on the edge. But they decided that if they were going to move forward, because they actually looked at that mission question that we all look at, but in a different way, right? Everyone talks about their mission, and it's wordsmithing. In their case, it was like, do we need to continue to exist, and why would we continue to exist? And when they looked at that, they saw the opportunities to be more relevant and more deeply connect with their community. So they have a recent grant from us now that they are alive and viable, and they have a new board that believes in that, and they shed the old board members who don't believe in this type of connection, because there were a lot of old guard board members who were looking back at the glory days of Fresno in the 70s, people who tended to be in their 70s, who wanted that to exist again, and the other people realized those days weren't coming back. So in specific, the two programs that we funded with their grant, one is an exhibition that has a well-regarded artist with one of his first solo shows paired with a community-sourced exhibition on the same themes of city, and looking at Fresno in particular and having Fresno residents submit their art, their photographs, to be exhibited in the gallery next to the one about the show. Well, guess how many people got involved with that? And with promotion from the paper, a lot more people attend this opening because people are engaged in a different way, and they get to see their point of view is important. These are just these aren't just the artists in the communities. These are community members who are all artists. We're actually all artists. It's part of being human. So to see that work displayed even in that way, and put on the walls in the same way in the Temple of Art, I think was very important. Another part of their grant is upcoming, and they're going to have a maker fair. This is actually tying in with the trend, as John talked about, people wanting to make things, to use that human creativity and actually build community. So what they're doing, because I don't think it's okay, we're not just going to fund every group that then comes forward with a maker fair. What they also had was really thoughtful program design and really closely working with the existing maker community in their area. They're really thoughtful about how they're going to market and promote this to make it about more of the community having access to this maker movement, some folks who only read about it in the paper or magazines, and trying to design it in a way that more people will attend to this in order to broaden the tent. So what I'm saying is cutting edge is in part because the group had to talk about survival and wanted to come up with a reason to exist that would be relevant in Fresno. If you think they can do it there, it's pretty amazing, right? We're talking about a city with incredible employment rate nearing 20%. We're talking a place with really low literacy rates, and yet they're getting incredible attendance and participation from community members who actually never knew they existed. So these are the people who wouldn't have cared, actually, if they had gone out of business. So I just want to emphasize that cutting edge art can come from anywhere. It's about looking at these trends and deciding how you want to be relevant to your community.
Thanks, Ted. That's a great example and kind of inspiring, because it's not just doing this to make the Irvine Foundation happy, right? It's doing it because they needed it to for their own survival. And so the next question, speaking of survival, recently at a San Francisco Symphony event, outgoing Chairman John Goldman reflected on the struggles that even robust arts institutions like the Symphony are having with declining support for the arts, kind of like the crisis you mentioned at the Fresno Art Museum, and challenged the new technology elite specifically, as well as his own peers, to step up or continue to dig deeper so that we may continue to benefit from a thriving arts community. So I'm curious if you've observed that similar trend among your grantees of declining support for the arts, and if so, are there some among your grantees who are employing any new fundraising tactics that those in our audience might learn from, and what your foundations are doing to influence peers and donors to encourage greater support for the arts? And for this, my lead responders are John and Tere. And Ted, this seems like particularly a role for the community foundation, so we'll start with you.
I think that I'll give one example. One of the organizations that we're working with is multidisciplinary, but mostly music and dance, which is Los Ensontles in San Pablo. And they have taken on not only just doing the music and training, youth and adults in it, but now creating their own YouTube productions, I guess. They have CDs. They're, doing programming on KQED, putting their programming out to other venues as well. And the idea is that it's not only engagement and looking at how the immediate community can benefit from it, but how can they get the work out beyond just the immediate community and audience, and also getting another income source. So the CDs are doing really well. They're now going into other communities and teaching other groups how to do this and how to not only relate to the community, but also get, like I said, another income source for them. So there's ways for groups to be creative about this. And one of the things that we're looking at, because as I said, when we looked at this, we were trying to see what is the ecosystem and what is it that the Bay Area looks like. If we're a community foundation, what do we do as a community foundation, looking at the entire community? And part of that was just the reality of it. I mean, if you have a garden and you don't water it for a while, you know what happens. So where were these spots out in the Bay Area of organizations doing great things, but we're not getting the appropriate resources or the watering in terms of funding or even just visibility, attention, so lifting up that work and trying to find those organizations that are doing great work, but they don't, somebody may not know about it unless they hear about it, and being able to be a community foundation that says, look, other funders, or look at other organizations, look at the great work that these organizations are doing. And then in addition to that, how can we, I've been working very closely with our donor services members of the staff to find out how can we get donors to also support this work, because that is our strength. That's our greatest asset, are our donors. And not to shift away what the donors have been doing up to now, but to have them look at there's other ways of supporting the ecosystem so that they can also feel good about sort of having impact with their funding as well. So we're really trying to do how to work with the donors to take them on site visits, to send them information about groups that we think might be of interest to them. And so far it's been slow, but it is working. And the good thing is that our donor services is very much a part of this team effort. And I think we're going to be doing some good work with them in the future.
So along those lines, we often get questions about community foundations and donor-advised funds, and particularly organizations that may not be grantees of the San Francisco Foundation, but then feel like they don't know how to get their visibility in front of donor-advised funds where there might be alignment. So what do you suggest around that if somebody wants to make those
It's
connections?
evolving. I think what happens is, the reality is, and I'm going to say that, if you're a donor and you put your funds in a community foundation, you know what you want to do with them. So we also want to be respectful and not let the donors feel that somehow or another they don't know what they're doing, or that, we want their money and we'll spend it for them. There is a firewall, I will say that, and it's one that is very much out of respect for the donors, because as you say, it's just think about it. Like I said, if it's your funds and you want it to go to a certain place, you may not be as open. But what we're trying to do is, and we have had a survey process that went out to all the donors to ask them, what are you funding now? What is your interest now? Would you be interested in reviewing other kinds of requests if we put them in front of you? And if so, what kinds of requests would you like to look at? So we're getting back that, because we just did it last year. We're getting returned questionnaires back to look at that, and then they'll be passed on to us, the ones that have to do with the arts. And then donor services, and we meet weekly to talk about what they're doing, and then also what areas that they see might have some openings in terms of us being able to contact some donors, or they'll say, so-and-so is interested in this kind of organization. And what do you have to put in front of them, or they want to go on site visits, and we'll do that. So it's something that we're building on, but right now there is no process for someone coming in and saying, please put us in front of a donor. Right now, we're not able to do that.
All right, thanks, Tate. And John, your thoughts about declining support and Hewlett's role in either helping nonprofits surface strategies or playing a lead role with donors and getting donors more involved.
I'm going to take this again from the macro support level rather than Hewlett specific. And first thing, I suppose, is to challenge the assumption of growth. When we saw the economic recession hit in 2008, 2009, I think we all were hoping that it was going to be a short dip, but 5 years later, we recognize that it's not. And so many arts organizations have had to adjust their budgets to this economic reality, as well as foundations have had to adjust their budgets to this economic reality. And as the economy is slowly beginning to improve and markets are beginning to improve, which means that foundations will have more money to give away in the long term, the philanthropic incentive for the arts, I think, is still being questioned and challenged, and that we have to consistently make the case why support the arts within our institutions. And that among our peers, we've had for several years now an ongoing conversation about capitalization. What are the resources your organization needs to achieve its mission over time? And what funder behavior encourages good capitalization? So, for example, multi-year general support is a good capital gift for you, not just for bricks and mortar, but because it gives the organization the flexibility and the liquidity to achieve their mission. Or if you do project support, funders should give enough overhead to cover the true costs of doing a project. So for the past 3 years, the funders have been engaging at the national level, looking at our behavior and what we can do to improve the capitalization of the field. And I have the feeling that over the next several years, you'll see that conversation turning more towards the arts sector now and say, what can we do together to ensure adequate capitalization of the field? And then fundraising tactics, we continue to see new and innovative ways of fundraising. Crowdsourcing has been great. Internet usage for very small amounts of money from a very diverse group of people. The East Bay Community Foundation has a fund for artists now where they give away $5,000 grants to individual artists, and those individual artists are required to match them. And it's usually about $510 gifts that they match it with. And so there's been this whole grassroots fundraising movement, similar to the Obama campaign, of how do we get everybody to do something, even if it's a little bit of money that aggregates up to something that's bigger and stronger. So I see that as the trend currently.
Great, thanks, John. My next question is something that I'm sure is on the minds of a lot of people, and it's just more of a logistics question because the arts is often part of cross-sector strategies. So if a prospective grantee has a potential project that crosses multiple portfolios like education and the arts or economic and workforce development, how should they navigate applying? And this is relevant to 4 of the panelists, so I'll ask you to keep it brief, but just give us the brief how-to. And Frances, we'll start with you and then go to Tere, John, and Ted.
Okay. I think that applicants often think that if they match 2 program areas, their chances of being funded are much greater. And in my experience, it is in fact harder to be successful with a proposal that addresses 2 program areas. It's not impossible, and we have sometimes made cross-programmatic grants. The other 3 grant-making areas at the Walter and Elise Haas Fund are Jewish Life, and we fund Jewish cultural organizations, but usually out of the Jewish Life program. Economic security, which is about helping low-income individuals advance themselves financially, and public education, which has an emphasis on community and partnerships for improving public schools, which includes organizations from the outside. So I can see, and we have had many grants that could be addressed to 2 areas. But when somebody comes in the door asking for dual support from 2 programs, they they have to know if both program areas have money available. Like often my peers have completely spent their budget, and so they can blow it in that way. But I will tell you a story of something that was a success in this arena and how it was navigated. It was a grant to BAVAC, the Bay Area Video Coalition. We have, through the arts program with a focus on at-risk, low-income youth, funded their Digital Pathways program. And they have an adult version of Digital Pathways for people to develop digital media skills that will help them advance in the workforce. And they also have this program for teens. So they came in the door asking about support for teens. And I observed that there was also this adult program. And in fact, there was a strong relationship between the two. It wasn't as if these are two different departments at BAVAC. So I went and took the proposal to our economic security program officer. She's enthusiastic about BAVAC. So we invited, in that case, a dual proposal, or we invited them to address both program areas. So I think the success was, yeah, maybe they would have figured out that they could ask both programs for grants. But in fact, that it came, that we thought of it, and that we advocated for the dual grant, that was what made it a success. So it's worth asking a program officer about when you're in conversation, and they'll usually steer you one way or another, and then there's some serendipity involved.
Ted?
We don't, I think we're very similar to Haas as well, in that we don't consider grants that come in that say we want you to get funding from these two different areas. I know that when applications come in and I do see maybe some cross-sector support, I will go to another program officer and say, will you do a co-fund? If I put in half, will you put in the other half? Mostly that happens with arts education, because as you can imagine, that's sort of a seamless kind of cross-sector endeavor. And that's worked very well, because in a way, it sort of, it gets more funding to arts education, because I'm able to have another program actually match the monies that we're putting into the arts education piece. And they come to us, so there is that recognition that if we work together, we're actually benefiting both programs. The only other place that it happens is, and it's something that I didn't talk about before, is that we have a small, it's a $100,000 Bay Area documentary fund. And that one is, I did go to each program officer and I said, I really would like you to understand this as a foundation-wide program, not just an arts funding mechanism. And can you put in at least $20,000 to $25,000 for a film if it aligns with your program? So if there's a film that comes in that has to do with Bay Area environmental issues, then the environmental program will actually fund that. Or if it's community health and across the 5 areas, and of course we'll do the arts and culture one. And everybody was enthusiastic. They have signed on. This is the 3rd year we're doing it this way. And it really helps because in a way they're supporting something that would be seen as an arts product, but at the same time they also understand the benefits of doing something like this. And it is specifically for early and pre-production support. So it's the riskier kind of funding for films, because the reality is we may never see the film get made, or it's not going to get made right away. But I think each of the program officers are able to understand how important it is for us as a community foundation to be able to provide that kind of support.
And John, how about cross-sector strategies at Hewlett?
Hewlett's other programs, education, environment, global development and population, philanthropy and special projects, are all international programs. It is very rare for us to do any kind of cross-program collaboration other than our arts education work, which is done entirely internal to the foundation and does not impact how people apply to the foundation. And it's very rare for us to do project support, so
Okay.
hardly ever happens.
Ted?
And mine can be brief as well, because it just is extremely rare that our other two programs even fund the same institutions ever. So the other two programs are youth, which focuses on 14 to 24-year-olds and providing them with real career paths, very involved with school districts and programs that are actually having some cutting-edge benefits, but rare that we have any connection with that because they have arts within those programs, and we're not involved with that. Other program, California Democracy, occasionally has the same grantees, but very rare that we would actually have any joint funding of a project. So it's basically not worth considering, but if there was something that we're deeply aligned, we would be able to identify that internally.